Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
There could be a new political party in town. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. It's called the Bread and Roses Party. Jerome Segal says he submitted 19,500 signatures to establish it in Maryland. Hopes the party will be able to run candidates by the next general election in 2020. Segal himself made a bid for the U.S. Senate and Democratic Party, but was unsuccessful. We have him on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So describe for me the Bread and Roses Party, and in fact, that particular phrase has certain historical significance, as I understand it.
That's right. The phrase Bread and Roses actually comes from a very famous strike of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912. And many of them actually were immigrants. It was the largest textile cluster of factories in the world, and it was a major strike, and at some point in the strike, women textile workers emerged as a distinct force and I think captured the public's imagination, and they marched under a banner I think that had never appeared before, which was Bread and Roses Too. And that no one has exactly known ever, I don't think, what roses means, but it means something that goes beyond bread. And in our interpretation, bread is basically the aspiration for a decent society in which people's needs are met irrespective of income. Everybody makes a contribution and so forth. And in many ways, it's similar to what a lot of progressive movements are about today. You could identify it with, let's say, the objectives, if not the specific policies advocated by Bernie Sanders and people who are called, socialists in the Democratic Party. But roses is really something that goes beyond that. And we identify roses as being beauty, meaningful work, and expanded leisure to do those things in life that are really important. And a lot of this links up with a book that I wrote called Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of the Alternative American Dream. And this came out of the simple living tradition and issue that was very much of interest in the late 1990s. And I was part of a group called the Simplicity Forum of authors who wrote about this. And what I argued is that contrary to most of my colleagues who were interested in simple living, the reason that Americans were focused on higher levels of income wasn't that they were suffering from some aberrant consciousness or excess consumerism, as much as it was that in the United States, it's extraordinarily expensive to meet very basic needs. And that what we needed actually were social and economic policies that would make the United States user-friendly to people who wanted to live a simpler life, rather than expecting them to form a counterculture. Rather, that our mainstream policies should be making it feasible to live what I call the alternative American dream, which is to live relatively modestly with abundant leisure, creativity, and time to do those things in life that were really valuable, and we're pluralistic as to how people will fill that in. In many, many simple living traditions, the Puritans were very different than the Quakers, and the Quakers were very different than Thoreau. And so all of that, is American diversity, but what it had in common was the idea that getting and spending wasn't the central part of life.
Let me ask you this. So you've described this party as being socialistic. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that we try to be very clear about what our ideals are or our objectives, but we want to get away from rather dogmatic baggage that was part of different phases of the socialist movement as to how to get there. So, for instance, not particularly enamored by the idea of social ownership of the means of production. Very much committed to something that Karl Marx articulated in his distributive formula, which was to each according to his ability, rather from each according to his ability, to each according to their needs, which in our interpretation means that it's a social contract that everybody has to make some contribution to society. It doesn't have to be paid employment. It could be in the home. It could be volunteer activity in the community. But everybody makes some contribution, and really from their deepest abilities. They really try to nurture their deepest self and their deepest values, and they bring them to the community, whether it's paid employment or not. And in exchange, their needs, they have the wherewithal to satisfy their core economic needs, regardless of what their income level is. And that may take the form of, Medicare option for all. It may be something that can be completely satisfied just by, a $15 an hour minimum wage, or it may require totally different kinds of programs. And what actually is required, there's no single answer. You have to actually work through the specific categories of need. And the most useful thing to do is to work off of the household budget and ask, what are people spending money for when they spend money in the things that the government collects information about? Like, we have a category called housing. And the question is, well, what's the real need in housing? Well, our view is actually that what people are spending money for in housing is much more than physical shelter. What they're really seeking is access to good neighborhoods, meaning neighborhoods where it's safe enough to tell your kids confidently, go out and play. And also there's good access to free public schools. And that's what drives people in the housing market. But the thing is, if that's the need that people have, even income growth, even equitable income growth isn't going to solve it, because it's really a supply problem. It's the fact that there are very few neighborhoods in America that give you that level of free public schools and public safety. Inside the Washington Beltway, there are a few, but it probably costs $700,000 to get a house there or more. And if you raised everybody's income, all that would happen is that you'd have 10,000 people in an auction the first time a house came up for sale in that neighborhood. And the price would go up from $700,000 to $2 million until basically you had the market clearing price. So there's some problems that you cannot solve through the market. You can't solve it even with greater equity. You need something else, which is a totally different approach to neighborhoods. And what a lot of people make is what economists call the fallacy of composition. They look at what works for one person and they project that onto the society as a whole and say we have to have policies that promote that. So, for instance, in neighborhoods I'm talking about, as an individual, what people try to do is to get enough money so they can escape. And that does work for the individual or family that escapes, right? They go from up the ladder. But the whole neighborhood can't escape because there's no place to go to, and the bottom of the ladder can't get up to the top of the ladder without pushing people down to the bottom of the ladder. So you have to have totally different kind of approach to certain kind of problems. But adequate food and clothing actually is the direct opposite. That's largely been handled in the United States through technology and agricultural revolution and so on. So it's all very different, and it has to be looked at very carefully in terms of specifics with a lot of policy creativity. Well, this is very outside anything that I'm familiar with as part of the socialist tradition.
Let me ask you this, Jerome. How do we get from, say, this predominance of certainly a marketplace, and we even saw with the Affordable Care Act was dependent upon the marketplace, even though we had government subsidies going to people to buy health insurance. How does one go from that to some of the solutions that you're talking about? I mean, it seems the market is very, very sticky when it comes to that kind of change.
We're actually not opposed to marketplace solutions. So, for instance, with respect to poverty, and that's the way in which I mean that we're not dogmatic, and we're really looking to redefine political identity, not the way it's done in America, which has to do with your focus on means. So, if you view big government as a solution, you're designated on the left. If you dislike big government, you're on the right. Well, you could be committed, for instance, to wanting to really solve the issue of poverty in the United States. And to me, that's the core of political identity. It's dedication to certain kinds of social objectives. And within that, it's, to me, completely pragmatic as to whether or not the best approaches are Lyndon Johnson's The Great Society or Richard Nixon's the Earned Income Tax Credit. And the truth be told, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which just basically puts cash in the pockets of low-income people at tax time, it's a reverse. It's a refundable credit, and the IRS sends people a check. But they then take that money and they go out into the market and they spend it on what they want, and there's no government bureaucracy running it. Well, that has actually done more to reduce poverty in the United States, I think, than anything that was part of the Great Society programs. So I think it's wacko for people to identify who they are politically, basically with, I line up with the Great Society or I line up with the Earned Income Tax Credit. The question is really to be open, experimental, pragmatic about what works, but to be dedicated, truly committed to solving certain key problems. And part of what we've got in the United States is a phoniness about a commitment to problems. So a lot of the people who say, we're for market solutions or we're for doing things through states, in truth aren't committed to solving the problems. But doing things through the states is exactly appropriate. Now, as John Dewey spoke of the United States in those days as having 48 laboratories within which we could experiment and learn how to overcome better key problems that we might all agree on. Unfortunately, what goes for turning it over to the states usually is really a way of turning away from dealing with real problems. So we saw, like, for instance, with Medicaid, when they turned it over, the states had a lot of discretion. And then you had these crazy Republican governors who basically are so, disinterested in dealing with the poverty of their own state citizens that they actually rejected what was available to them to transform the health insurance situation of people in their own state that will be funded by the government as a whole. So that's a kind of phoniness. But if you've got people who are genuinely committed to dealing with these things and want to do experiments on the state level, I think it's exactly a good way to go. Let's learn from that. And if we do learn something comprehensive, it can be duplicated across the country, either on the statewide level or at that point go national.
Let me ask you this. Do you make a distinction between liberals and socialists? I'm actually reminded of something that occurred, I think it was during the presidential campaign, when Hillary Clinton was talking about health care, and she said, well, we aren't Denmark, referring to the socialist programs there. Is there a difference between liberals and socialists or socialistic options?
Of course, socialist depends on what you define it as. When I said I identified with the early Marx, okay, I think that it's in the early Marx that you find the best understanding of capitalism. And I define socialism as something that believes in two things. One, the distributive principle that I talked about before, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And then secondly, believes that there's something better than capitalism, or that capitalism has played its historic role, and now it's time to go on to something better, okay? But the question is, well, what do you mean by capitalism, right? And there's a lot of confusion about that. Capitalism is not free markets. It's not industrialization. It's not, trade. All of that existed independent of capitalism, some of it before capitalism, some of it thousands of years before capitalism. What capitalism is what Marx talks about in the early manuscript on alienated labor. And he uses alienated in the sense of to alienate, the verb to sell. And what capitalism is what happens when the way we produce things goes from a level of tools that could, in principle, be owned by master craftsmen, and they would have apprentices in small shops and produce things, to modes of production that are so massive and extensive that it's impossible for any worker or craftsman and so on to own the tools. So what you have is this division between entities that really own the tools, which are factories and plants and international supply chains and so on, and everybody else. And the familiar distinction today is between people who call themselves job creators and the rest of us who are preparing for jobs in the job market, preparing resumes, pushing our schools to equip our kids better to get that, and so on. All of that is the job system. And it's only been around for about 200 years and doesn't even exist in much of the world, and has only become dominant in the United States in the last, century and a half. And the job system is failing in a whole variety of ways. And even when it's not failing, it's deeply inadequate, because what it does is it separates the individual's deepest abilities from what he actually does in his work. His work is defined by the job creators. That is, they determine exactly the scope of the job, the hours, the framework, the nature of the product, the contribution that the individual will make, and so on. And that's the fundamental alienation of the job system. Now, the word that gets the alternative historic word for the job system in classical Marxist economics is capitalism. It's basically, but you start talking about capitalism and people's eyes glaze over. You talk about the job system and how do we get beyond the job system, and you reduce something to what I call its wonkishness. It's the kind of thing that people in Washington get their teeth into. For instance, how well is the job system working? Is it going to continue to work? What's the crisis in the job system? Is our current job system distorting what we do with schools? And this is one of the things that I explored in my Senate campaign in the Democratic Party. We did polling, very deep polling, asked the kind of questions that nobody ever asks voters, and we got extraordinary answers. For instance, just on this topic, I put one question that we put forward is, what do you think about the following point of view, which is that it's totally understandable that parents concerned about the limited potential over the long run of there being good jobs for their kids turn to the schools to better equip their kids to compete in a market of declining supply of good jobs. Well, that's totally reasonable on a personal level. Unfortunately, as social policy, what it's doing actually is it's resulting in the kids being under incredible stress. It's driving the family crazy, and it's distorting the schools. It's distorting the schools away from their educational function and from really important things like teaching history, the humanities, and the arts. Okay, we said, what do you think about that perspective? Right? 35% of Democrats said, I totally agree. I absolutely agree, right? Well, I was flabbergasted. Who knew? I thought that was the most minority position in the world, because you go and you listen to the gubernatorial race, which I've done, and everybody is chattering about schools and education. They make no difference between schools and education. They don't even seem to be aware that there's a difference between what education is really about, real education, and whatever you make schools do, And a third of the Democrats in the state already think that what we're doing is crazy. And believe it or not, another 40% said, I agree somewhat. So it's like 75% knew that there was substantial truth in this framework, and only about 15% said, I disagree. And it was so revealing to me that, on the one hand, the public, when you probe them with a subtle question, actually is very clear about understanding that we're on the wrong track, and yet it's not reflected in public discourse, public campaigns at all.
Do you think
Red Roses seeks really to deepen political discourse by actually engaging voters at a deeper level of what do they mean by the American dream? What are their real values? What are their real aspirations for themselves and for their children? And when you do that, you find that, American political discourse almost is like floating in the clouds, really detached from people's deepest aspirations and values.
Let me ask you this, Jerome. Do you see the landscape changing? I mean, one of the things that struck me is that if we move further and further away from the Cold War and what seemed to be symbols of the Cold War of socialism, i.e. various communist countries, do you see that shifting? We had, for instance, they obviously Occupy Wall Street it created a certain strong chord for Americans. What do you see the landscape shifting now?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders played, a really great historic role. I think Donald Trump did also, but in different, ironically and in different ways. But what Bernie demonstrated is that for what I call bread, that is the decent society, right? It's possible to mobilize tens of millions of people around that. Bernie's definition of socialism, I think, wasn't even serious for him. I mean, he defined socialism basically, in terms of a liberal, basically, a liberal agenda. It was basically, the New Deal and so on. But it's important. It's vital. It's decency. It's bread in terms of its objectives, right? And what Bernie showed is that it's possible to mobilize millions of people about that passionately and to win elections and to raise vast amounts of money. And he's moving the Democratic Party, I believe, much more forcefully to engage the long overdue agenda, which is shameful. And I think he's right. He talks about it as shameful, and he talks about the way in which the United States fails to do things that are done in every other industrialized country, in the democratic world, let's say. Okay? So he's right about that, and there's a change there. But it's limited. Okay? I characterize it sometimes as narrow, shallow, and uncreative, but absolutely necessary. Absolutely is necessary. And what Bread and Roses is about is going beyond that. And when I say narrow, by the way, part of what I mean is that it's so U.S. focused, there's no international dimension. And just to get this off my chest, in the Democratic primary, right, I was running against Ben Carden, and half of what my campaign was about is just what we're talking about. But the other half was about international issues. And Carden's real contribution, or miscontribution, in the Senate is in international affairs. At the time, he was a ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, and he was AIPAC's guy, AIPAC's representative, the joint drafter of legislation on anything in the Middle East that bears on Israel, including Iran, right? He was one of 4 Democrats who crossed the aisle and voted with all the Republicans against Obama's nuclear deal, knowing that this is Netanyahu's game plan for an American attack on Iran. And so this is the Democratic leadership. And here's the thing. Not one progressive organization in Maryland endorsed anyone in the Senate race. And here I had taken on the only time in American political history, it had happened that somebody singled out someone in Congress, a sitting member of Congress, who was AIPAC's chief guy, right? The main guy that was the communications belt between AIPAC and the Israeli embassy and members of Congress, right? And went after him just for this kind of mindlessness on a whole variety of things, whether it was the vote against Iran, whether it was his determination to keep the UN Security Council out of Middle East issues, or it was his crazy legislation, his so-called anti-BDS legislation, which would have felonized anybody boycotting Israel or Israeli settlements over anything, by the way, not just over settlement building. Carden's legislation would have made it a 20-year felony to boycott Israel if Israel decided to kick out the Palestinians. There were no exceptions as to what the cause of this could be. And he got 50 senators to co-sponsor it, right? Thoughtless, mindless, bizarre for liberals, right? Takeover of all our thought processes when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. That's AIPAC's influence, and it's a disease. I talked about it as mental corruption of the Senate, right? Okay, not one progressive organization endorsed, and believe it or not, the Washington Post never mentioned this part of the campaign. In fact, it didn't even cover the Senate campaign at all. I went to Bernie Sanders' office early on, hoping to get an endorsement from him. They wouldn't let me see Bernie. They said, go talk to Our Revolution, his spin-off thing. I went to Our Revolution. I joined the Montgomery chapter. And so when I spoke at meetings, I talked about the embarrassment of a progressive organization not focusing on international affairs. I got a resolution through Montgomery County chapter of OR unanimously telling state OR, wake up, engage in this race for the U.S. Senate and endorse a candidate on the merits. It didn't have to do with me in particular. I actually had 6 other people running against Curtin, including Chelsea Manning, right? But it said, engage in this and endorse someone. And you know what state OR did? Completely ignored it. And I made so many entreaties to national OR, about this, and they completely ignored it. So our revolution actually completely abandons foreign policy, right? So that's what I mean by the narrowness of, what calls itself progressive politics or socialism.
Finally,
there's shallowness, and there's a lack of creativity. That's and there's a political culture that we want to get away from.
Finally, I wanted to ask you, so what do you see as the purpose of this party? Because in order to create parties, in order to establish them, I mean, that's like you've got to organize on the ground. It takes a lot of effort. There's only been one successful third party that we've seen. How do you see the role of your party?
We're trying to invent a new model of a political party. I'm 74 years old. I am not planning, to recreate, the Socialist Party of America with Norman Thomas at its head, or Debs, and so on. Basically, I'm thinking about calling something the Bread and Roses electoral platform. And what I really believe is that in America, the real arena, free speech arena, in which people change, in which people dialogue and so on, is electoral politics. So if you really want to talk to people and you really want them to listen, you do it within the context of elections. And that means you've got to put people on the ballot. But it doesn't mean that winning is what it's all about. What it's all about is the campaign, right? The campaign is when you talk to people. The campaign and the possibility of running on this, that is the way in which you not only, put your own ideas out there, you affect the thinking of other people. You affect the thinking of the Democratic Party as to, how will they respond if Bread and Roses puts up a counter candidate? How do they build our stuff in? So some of it is actually affecting stuff inside as well as on the right. So we're prepared to speak to Republicans and to speak to independents. We don't see ourselves as merely, doing an inside the Democratic Party thing across the board. But what we see is really something that's relatively nimble. We need a new way for parties to choose their candidates. The thing that I saw in this endorsement process with these ridiculous questionnaires, all these progressive organizations, they spend their time. It's like college. They spend their time writing these questionnaires, and then they submit these questionnaires, and then they evaluate the questions. That's not how you find out whether or not somebody, is a political leader worth supporting. You send them that questionnaire, and what does Curtin do with it? He says, all right, who on my staff is not busy? You go to the Congressional Research Service, and you go to the Congressional Budget Office, and so on, and whip me up within 72 hours the best answer to this questionnaire that'll affect this particular group, and we'll send it to them. And then the group takes all that seriously and runs that against a similar questionnaire sent to somebody, who grew up in the streets, and someone is entering political office for the first time. It's crazy. It's just crazy. So we're looking for new ways of selecting candidates and bringing in new kinds of candidates, different kinds of expertise, and so on, but with a different political culture, but very clear on our ideals, very clear that we have a different concept of the American dream. One that, by the way, in this polling I was telling you about, we found that over 70% of Democrats in Maryland said that their American dream actually involved modest levels of consumption. It involved, being able to have their needs met and having enough leisure to do the important things in life. It wasn't, I want to be like Trump, or I want to be in the top 10%, or any of that, And that's really fundamental, because, you see, if the American dream really is not what all sorts of people have been telling us is, for instance, that each generation will do better than the preceding generation. Well, where is that written in stone that that's the American dream? I don't think that's the American dream. I don't think American history sustains that. These guys are often talking about the dream of people in Europe who heard that the streets are paved with gold and came to the United States. But that's not the dream of the people who made this country. So my view is actually that if you get the American dream wrong, every policy across the board is wrong, because the touchstone for any policy making sense, right, is that it contributes to the pursuit of happiness in America the way people themselves understand it. That's what we have in the Declaration of Independence. And we've got almost zero significant discourse in the United States today as to what is the real American dream, or put differently, what is an economy for anyhow? How does what goes on in the economy relate to human happiness? And that's what our party is about. It's those issues and giving different answers to that than what's out there.
Right, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Jerome Segal, he is attempting to establish a new party, Bread and Roses Party, with socialistic goals. And Jerome, we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Don.
Okay. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.